And so truce talks have collapsed between that were brokered by Qatar between Israel and Hamas as Israel makes clear that even in the face of global opposition, it intends to launch its invasion of Rafa. This is a city of some 300,000 people at the start of the war, is now a city of some, let's say, 1.3, 1.4 million people. It's impossible to know precisely. People are packed on top of each other in there. It was said to be kind of one of the last and only safe places in Gaza. Of course, it has been hit by IDF airstrikes since the very beginning, sporadically. Just recently, more than 100 people were killed in airstrikes there. From the podium, the State Department has said it would be a disaster if Israel went in. John Kirby has said it will be a disaster. But at the same time, and you can put up the first element here about the truce talks ending inconclusively. But at the same time, the new reporting is that the United States has not only gotten basically no concessions from the Israelis, but and relatedly is suggesting there will be no consequences if Israel completely rejects our insistence that they not engage in this assault. And so John Kirby was asked about what the U.S. position was on the Israeli assault on Rafa. Here he is.
Oh, we never said that they can't go into Rafa to remove Hamas. Hamas remains a viable threat to the Israeli people, and the Israelis and the IDF absolutely are going to continue operations against their leadership and their infrastructure, as they should. We don't want to see another October 7th. What we said is that we don't believe that it's advisable to go in a major way in Rafa without a proper, executable, effective, and credible plan for the safety of the more than 1 million Palestinians that are taking refuge in Rafah. They've left the north, and they certainly went south out of Khan Yunis to try to get out of the fighting. So Israel has an obligation to make sure that they can protect them.
What's crazy is that John Kirby was recently given a promotion. He's now overseeing all comms for basically the entire kind of, I forget exactly his title, but it was a signal that the White House is pleased with how he's been doing at the podium. But what he says from the podium about what Israel ought to do is as useful as what I say from right here about what Israel ought to do. He's like, Israel has obligations not to kill civilians, to give them an opportunity to find safe passage. I hope that they do this. I say the same thing.
Well, it's very useful, Ryan.
They're listening to neither of us. But yet he is one of the most powerful people in the world, representing the most powerful government in world history. Yet he can't get even the most basic concessions from a country of 10+ million people.
Well, Joe Biden, who actually, and this is not a cheap shot, in a speech where he's trying to prove how great and competent he is, confused the president of Mexico with the president of Egypt, and is the one basically the commander-in-chief. He's the one ultimately, at the end of the day, that's brokering these negotiations. Obviously, they've sent Burns from the CIA, and they have other people who are doing the day-to-day negotiations, but it's his decisions at the end of the day, and he's not all there. So you have to also wonder how much that's affecting the dialogue and the decisions that are being made when you have negotiations like this happening. Obviously, they're happening between the U.S., Egypt, Israel, and Qatar, as you mentioned, but Joe Biden's not there. But he's ultimately, the buck stops with him, and they know they're negotiating on his behalf. But what does anyone know about what he thinks should happen in those negotiations?
And everything we hear about the decision-making in the White House is that this is a very Biden-driven policy.
Yeah.
And, Biden is not senile. Like, he mixes things up. He's not as sharp as he used to be. But, he still has his faculties in the sense that he is as he says, a committed Zionist, and he is a committed supporter of Israel, basically unconditionally to the end. And I think he's kind of the last of this breed of
yes.
kind of liberal Democrats who are going to feel this way.
That's Fetterman erasure, but sure.
Well, yeah, maybe Fetterman's a whole nother thing. But if you had a Gavin Newsom or J.B. Pritzker or Whitmer as president right now, or even Kamala Harris right now, I think there would be a more balanced approach, where from Biden, the signal down to his people is that there is nothing that the U.S. is going to do to restrain Israel.
But I think his
Period.
senility,
Beyond talk.
But that's where I think his senility is affecting this, because yes, that it's all downstream of that, but nobody knows what implementing that looks like when he's saying other things too, for public relations purposes, when you're sending people to Dearborn to have these conversations. I mean, I don't know what's going on behind closed doors, but I do think that what he actually wants to happen for political purposes and what he wants to happen for moral purposes, there's a lot of muddied water in between those things, which is leading to a completely muddied policy.
I don't think we need senility to explain it, because the White House has been clear that what their strategy is. They called it the bear hug. They laid it out very clearly. We're going to be super friendly to Israel in public. That's going to bias the credibility with the Israeli leadership and with the Israeli public, to then be critical behind the scenes, and that is going to give us the maximum amount of influence. Like, that was the strategy that they have laid out, and we've seen them execute it. Every day we get multiple articles from sources familiar saying that Joe Biden called Netanyahu some other name.
Yes.
Like a doo-doo face, or a jerk.
An effing jerk.
All the different things. He's very frustrated, increasingly frustrated, in fact. Every single day he gets increasingly frustrated, and so that allows news organizations to continue saying that he's increasingly frustrated because he's more frustrated than he was the day before. And so that's not senility. That's an expression of this bear hug strategy.
It's the White House's expression of the bear hug strategy.
It's what it would look like if you were going to do this. It also isn't working. Like, it has been signaled to Netanyahu that that's what we were going to do. So he hears it, and he just last week went on ABC Sunday Morning and said, I appreciate Biden's money. I appreciate what he has to say about this, but we're going to do what we're going to do.
Yeah.
Like, he and his party have consistently said, we're going to do what we're going to do. And in the face of that, you can either try a new strategy, which uses actual leverage, which you have, the money, or you can just continue to get increasingly frustrated and come up with new names that you're going to leak to the New York Times that you called Netanyahu. And I wish you could pin that on senility. I think it's just what Biden wants to do. And he must be comfortable with the outcome. Otherwise, he would do something different.
I agree with that completely. I think the senility leads to some bad, I guess, I think the senility affects the strategy and the expression of the strategy, but I think it makes a bad strategy worse, essentially. But
I think his brain might be stuck in time. Like, he might not be able to adapt to the new political realities of 2024.
Possibly.
Because he keeps talking about Golda Meir, and he seems very rooted, like, in that that liberal
era.
Zionist understanding of the project.
Yes, in the sort of Carter era,
which doesn't really exist anymore.
And so
there is no Golda Meir wing anymore.
To your point, the thing John Kirby just said there about having an operation, he's saying we don't want a large scale, something massive basically in Rafa, but we also don't want another October 7th. So that's actually a pretty interesting quote. It's totally unsurprising, but it's actually a pretty important glimpse into what the strategy is, or distillation of what the strategy is, which is that to prevent October 7th, to prevent another October 7th, these operations have to continue. And obviously they just rescued 2 hostages from Rafa. So that's a powerful sort of bargaining chip in their selling of their strategy. But if this is preventing another October 7th, it goes back to this question Biden fundamentally believes. They disagree on one-state solution, two-state solution, but they fundamentally agree that they can eradicate Hamas. And that is, the evidence for that crumbles every single day.
Right.
Even if you're rescuing hostages.
Yeah, and Hamas reported that in that operation, which involved these devastating airstrikes that killed more than 100 civilians, Hamas's Telegram channel reported they also injured eight hostages, 3 of whom died from their injuries. And so that's why the families of the hostages have been urging them to accept a deal that involves exchanging hostages rather than barreling guns blazing into Rafa, because the chance that you kill the hostages in the process of trying to rescue them is very high.
And then having to wait on tenterhooks to find out whether the Hamas propaganda that 3 hostages were killed is true.
Right.
I mean, it's just unimaginable, torturous uncertainty.
And they don't say who.
For those families.
Right.
Yeah.
So now you don't know if your family member's still alive, period. Now you don't know if they lived this hell of 4 months in captivity, that then they died in an aerial bombardment by the IDF or not. Yeah.
So let's put B3 up on the screen. This is Tear Street Scoop. Israeli minister blocking flour. Bibi promised Biden would be allowed into Gaza. That is a picture of Bezalel Smotrich, and he is the Israeli minister in question here. Ryan, tell us about what's happening with this.
So the U.S. negotiated a deal whereby they would send in an enormous amount of flour into Gaza. That Matt Miller at the State Department yesterday said it would be enough flour, I think, for like 1.5 million Palestinians for 5 months. Now, how you turn that flour into bread or anything else is an open question for people in Gaza. If you talk to them, it's very difficult for them to find wood to burn, to cook. It's almost impossible to find, electricity. Or a stove, or like all the bakeries have been destroyed. And also clean water, which you need for flour as well. All of that is a challenge. However, getting enormous amounts of flour into Gaza would be a godsend for the starving people there. Chris Van Hollen in his speech the other day said that on Sunday he for the first time was hearing reports of people actually dying of starvation, which is a step beyond being on the brink of starvation and famine. And he texted Cindy McCain, who's the head of the World Food Program, and she said, "Yes, I can confirm that. Yeah. Like this is happening. There's not enough food getting in. Famine is imminent. People are actually dying at this point. So, and the people who are not dying are going to suffer, particularly the children, lifelong kind of physical, not just the obvious trauma, but physical problems for the rest of their life from the lack of nutrition for this extended period of time is going to retard their physical and emotional development.
Lots of kids.
In a way, yeah. Hundreds of thousands of children. Because Gaza's 2 million plus people, and half are children.
And in Rafa right now,
right,
which before was
Rafa.
You had 300,000 people in Rafa, and now you're
right.
Just have multiplied that, incalculably.
And so Smotrich, who's one of the hardest right members of the Israeli cabinet, has the capacity to stall this from getting in. And so now the U.S. is going to have to put some pressure on him and have stern conversations privately until he gets out of the way and lets it in. Not letting in flour to starving people is a war crime. Like, this guy should be in prison for the rest of his life for just for this one act. Meanwhile, there are now raves being hosted, and we can put this up here outside of Gaza. You've had for weeks now, and if you're listening on the podcast, we're showing this is an actual rave at.
Pretty pathetic looking rave.
Pretty pathetic looking rave, but a rave nonetheless, by the border, by the fence where aid trucks are trying to get into Gaza. There, for weeks now, Israeli civilians, clearly with the cooperation of the military, like the military, this is deep into the desert. The military could block civilians from getting down here if they wanted to, have been protesting and blocking aid from getting in. So it's not just the government that is using all the tools at its disposal to prevent humanitarian aid from getting into Gaza, but civilians themselves are going down there, and now they're dancing to electronic music while they're doing it. It's one of the more obscene things I think I've ever seen. At the same time, South Africa has gone back to The Hague and asked for an emergency injunction to try to stop Israel from going into Rafa. It's not as if they could even enforce that if they could get it implemented. But every single day, people like Smotrich are producing more and more evidence for The Hague.
So let's roll John Kirby being asked about some of the tactics of the IDF and making a hell of a comparison, totally unprompted, by the way.
This is B5.
Yeah, let's roll B5.
We have seen them take actions, sometimes actions that even I'm not sure our own military would take, in terms of informing civilian populations ahead of operations, where to go, where not to go. They have taken steps. Now, obviously, those steps, while noteworthy, haven't been enough to reduce the civilian casualties, which is why the president spoke so forthrightly about it yesterday, and why we're going to continue to do everything we can to press the Israelis to be more careful.
But respectfully, he's been talking forcefully about it for a long time, and the Israelis are now have hammered people into this tiny corner in southwest Gaza, tight up against the Egyptian border, where people think there's a looming catastrophe happening. Shouldn't there be more forceful action than just words?
We are working very, very closely with our Israeli counterparts. We've made clear our concerns that we would not support a Rafa operation that did not properly account for the more than 1 million refugees that are down in Rafa. We've been very, very clear and consistent about that.
So, Ryan, it's not the first time we've heard that comparison, but what was interesting in that line is that nobody was asking him to compare the U.S. and the IDF.
It's the first time we've heard it from Democrats. If you remember, Ted Cruz made that exact comparison when we interviewed him. Mm-hmm. And you may have...
Well, you pushed him on it because he had said it earlier, and you pushed him to sort of explain it.
Yeah, and so you may have had the same experience, but afterwards, I got a ton of messages, emails from current and former service members, American service members, who were appalled to hear him say that, saying that, for instance, we'd have a high-value target, let's say in Baghdad, in a house, somebody like an ace of spades, somebody that they'd been gunning for months, and there was, one potential civilian nearby, and the whole thing would be called off. The idea that Israel is doing that does not scan at all.
The New York Times did an in-depth comparison of the U.S. military and the IDF's operations. Now, this was more than a month ago at this point, so obviously some of these numbers may have changed because the type of war basically changed when the calendar year changed. Under pressure from the U.S., we still don't actually know exactly how all of that transpired, but so maybe these ratios are different. But when the New York Times looked into it a little more than a month ago, the numbers did not suggest that John Kirby was right to make that comparison in terms of civilian casualties.
The actual comparison that you can make was with Hamas on 10/7, which was I think, 2-to-1, civilian to military casualties, which we would all consider horrific and horrifying. Does John Kirby think that Hamas's proportionality on 10/7 was appropriate? I mean, that's insane.
Except that...
Like, the numbers are roughly the same. The proportionality between the number of Hamas figures that Israel claims to have killed and the number of women and children that we know it has killed, versus on 10/7, the number of soldiers and security forces Hamas killed versus the number of civilians who were killed.
And obviously Hamas argues that was a defensive action, even though I think most observers in the West would say it was offensive, at least in terms of the question of the actual military operation. Hamas argues that it's resistance, that it's defensive.
But either way, it's military versus civilian. It's like 1 for every 2. And Kirby's suggesting that that's equivalent somehow to how the U.S. would operate?
Well, him offering the comparison up is insane. Like, nobody was asking him. Nobody was confronting him with numbers about the U.S. He just volunteered.
You can see in the clip that he's just kind of, he's like, and actually, and he's been in comms. Like, never mind, I don't want to get into Kirby, but
it's
just
ridiculous.
Utterly, ridiculous.
Offensive.
Now, and also, he's forcing me to sit here and defend the U.S. military, which is probably
you don't want to do that.
Killed like 4 million people in the last 20 years. So it's not as if we're like some angels out here. Mm-hmm. And the absolute scale and power.
His administration, the way they got out of Afghanistan with a massive civilian casualty incident.
And
yes.
The massive amount of power that we've projected around the globe has meant that the scale of our slaughter has been significantly greater than what's happened in the last 4 months in Gaza. But by proportion and by execution, It's absolutely not even close. Like the U.S. military has also, setting aside the absolute collapse of discipline. If you pretend that what the Israeli soldiers are doing on TikTok is undisciplined and is outside of the strategy, it might be. I think at this point you have to say it's part of the strategy because it's so rampant and so many soldiers are allowed to just post their war crimes on TikTok. You see they raided a woman's house in the West Bank the other day and were holding up her lingerie and posting photos of themselves with it. Haaretz just did an article about how they're cooking with all of the Palestinians like spices and using their kitchens to cook their meals. Anyway, it's bad stuff. And to compare that, for John Kirby to actively denigrate the U.S. military in service of what more than a dozen countries have already concluded is a genocide is just beyond the pale. I didn't think I'd wind up here.
It should be a bigger story from yesterday that he offered that up. Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.